Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight's signature lecture is co-sponsored by the Canadian International Council's Waterloo Region branch. I'd also like to thank CIGI's regular public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Besides the audience here tonight, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI in the aisles, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. For those using Twitter during tonight's event, we encourage you to use the hashtag CIGILive to join in the online conversation. I'd now like to ask Joan, President of the Waterloo Region branch of the Canadian International Council, to make welcome remarks on behalf of our co-sponsor.
Just a word of welcome to everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be part on this event, our fifth annual media event, and we're so looking forward to being able to hear such a wonderful panel and the fact that we can all participate if we so wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. Our topic tonight is bordered biases, national identity in world news coverage. As consumers of news media and as creatures of habit, we all might be unaware of how our own biases, including natural Canadian biases, could be built into the news coverage we receive of world events. As Canadians, we may notice a different tone and perspective in, say, how Fox News covers world affairs with a particular conservative American flavor. Or perhaps that flavor is the intended impact of Fox's owner, Australian Rupert Murdoch. And we can see readily how that perspective differs from, say, a CBC or a CTV report on the same event. Here in Canada, we can also watch the BBC. We see differences there. Those who travel frequently may see English language coverage from Russian networks or Al Jazeera. It isn't just the accents of the news presenters that are different. Something else is going on. So our question tonight is, how does national identity of the reporter, of the editors, of the network owners, or of the audience really affect the news that we receive here in Canada or anywhere in the world? We have an excellent panel here tonight to address this topic. I have the great privilege of introducing our moderator tonight, Mr. Steve Paikin, who's been a previous visitor to CIGI and whom I first met in the journalism business some 20 years ago. Steve will then introduce our esteemed panel, at least one of whom I've also been fortunate enough to work with side by side in the newsroom, Mitch Potter of the Toronto Star. Steve Paikin is anchor and senior editor of The Agenda with Steve Paikin, TV Ontario's flagship current affairs program. Before that, he was co-host of Studio 2, TVO's previous nightly current affairs program, and Diplomatic Community, the network's weekly foreign affairs program. An award-winning journalist, Steve was born in Hamilton, so was I, it's a great honor, has a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Toronto, a master's degree in broadcast journalism from Boston University. Earlier in his career, he worked at the CBC in Toronto and covered Queen's Park for a few years. He's hosted coverage of several elections and political leadership conventions, but he also has global experience, having reported, for example, from war zones, from Lebanon and Israel in 1985, Bosnia in 1993. He's produced several excellent feature-length documentaries. He's the author of 4 books, 3 of them on politics, including a biography of former Premier John Robarts, and 1 book on Canada's other national and sometimes less violent sport, which is hockey. So please join me in welcoming this evening's moderator, Steve Paikin.
Thank you very much, Fred. It's great to be with you this evening. I indeed have been here before many times, but never for this event, and I'm particularly excited to share the stage with this very august group of people here. Nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. Herb Epp, remember sticking a few microphones in your face over the years back in provincial parliament. Walter McLean, good to see you again too. Pleasure to be in the room with you guys as well. But you know, my cousin was mayor of this place about 50 years ago. I don't know if you know that. Harold Paikin was the mayor of Waterloo here about 51 or 2 years ago. And despite that, you're never going to see my name on a ballot. Don't worry about that. The most important thing you need to know this evening is that I'm PVRing Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. which I'm going to watch when I go home. So I'm sure all of you have got one of these devices here. If you found out who won the game, don't tell me. Very important, okay? No point in watching the game if you know who's won it already. We're going to have a discussion up here to start things off, and then at a certain point I'll give everybody the 2-minute warning, and we've got microphones on the side there, and you can line up, and we very much want your participation as well. This is only going to work as well as it might if you all decide to participate as well. So we look forward to your questions, and we also have, this is streaming all over the world apparently, so we may get some questions from those who are online, and we'll try and work those into the mix as well. Let me introduce our panelists this evening. Diana Swain, one of Canada's leading investigative journalists, senior investigative correspondent for CBC News. Her work is frequently seen on the National and on the Fifth Estate. She has received 8 Gemini nominations, won the Gemini for Best News Anchor 3 times, which means, Diana, between the two of us, we have 3 Geminis. When Fred said I'm an award-winning no, not really, actually. I don't think I've won anything. Anyway. Mitch Potter serves as Washington bureau chief with the Toronto Star. It's his 3rd foreign assignment after previous postings to London and Jerusalem. He oversaw the Toronto Star's coverage of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He won a 2006 National Newspaper Award for his reportage in Afghanistan. His dispatches include datelines from 26 different countries in this century alone. Kevin Carmichael, Globe and Mail correspondent based in Washington, D.C., where he writes primarily about the U.S. economy, monetary policy, and global economic policy. Before joining the Globe in 2008, he also worked at the Canadian Press, Bloomberg News, doing stints in Halifax, Ottawa, and Washington. And finally, a guy I used to work for. Tony Berman has done absolutely everything in television news. He is the former head of Al Jazeera English and CBC News, now teaches at Ryerson University School of Journalism, also writes a weekly column on world affairs for the Toronto Star, and at the 2007 Gemini Awards, he received the Gordon Sinclair Award for Lifetime Achievement in Broadcast Journalism because he has done absolutely everything in television news. Welcome them if you would, everybody. Tony, let me get you to start us off tonight. We're not going to have any opening statements. We're just going to get right into it. You've been all over the world, and I want you to tell us whether you think it is or has been an advantage to be a Canadian reporting from abroad.
I think it has been when one reports for a Canadian audience, and a Canadian audience that wants the Canadian perspective, I mean, which I think many Canadian news organizations, and certainly the CBC, is committed to. I think where I've had you ask me the question 4 years ago, before my experience with Al Jazeera, I would have been kind of unqualified in my enthusiasm for that perspective. But I do think that many of us who live, including here in Canada, want not only the Canadian perspective, but they also want a broader, more diverse perspective. And I think in that sense, there's an argument, whether it's through Al Jazeera, through the BBC, through The Economist, The Guardian. I think there is an argument that to get a comprehensive view of the world, one as crucial as the Canadian perspective is, and Canadian reporters abroad are, I think it's also important to tap into other sources.
You say you're a little less bullish about that answer, given your experience with Al Jazeera. What changed?
Well, I'm not less enthusiastic about the need for Canadians to report the Canadian perspective. What I am totally sold on is that there are certain news organizations that are blessed through resources or whatever in being able to tap into reporters from particular regions that know the culture, know the language, that are able to give a kind of an insider's perspective, whether it's of Yemen, whether it's of Syria, whether it's of Latin America. I think the perspective that, and I dealt with them in my role with Al Jazeera for a period of 3 or 4 years, and I think many of them provide a kind of a dimension and an inside look at stories that many of us Canadians who either lived abroad for a brief period of time or are kind of parachuted into news events simply can't bring, So I guess if I, as a Canadian here living in Canada, it would be, I think, very difficult and very limiting to me if I solely relied on the Canadian perspective on all issues. And I think now, through the magic of technology, whether it's television or print or obviously the web, I think we can now tap into a variety of perspectives. In other words, I think the nationality does influence, if not determine, the perspective. And I think as such, I think we should probably seek a variety of sources.
I'm going to pick up on that later. We'll revisit that. Diana, how about you? An advantage to be a Canadian reporting abroad?
I think it can be, and maybe not for the reasons that people expect. I mean, we value our role in the world, and we do a lot of discussing and hand-wringing in Canada about our role in the world. But when we go out there, the reality is we are a small country. We are seen as a small player. Sometimes that can work to our advantage, that we're frankly seen as, in some ways, benign. If you get to a place and you're trying to get access to people, I think if you're an American journalist, and I'm sort of positing this theory now because I haven't worked as an American journalist, I think it can be tougher, that there's a greater intent to want to manipulate what you're seeing, what you're told, because of America's role in the world. Canada is seen as a sidebar in many cases, and I think that that can be our advantage because people are less inclined to want to manipulate what they tell you. They're less frightened by what you might do with the information. I think it allows us sometimes greater access, and I've tried to use that on occasion, to be seen to be maybe less threatening, less influential.
More of an honest broker?
Yeah, because I think we are still seen that way. I mean, notwithstanding our involvement in places like Afghanistan, which is now, I think, widely somewhat understood in parts of the world, and if not in others. I think we're still seen as being a level-headed player on the global scene, and that as journalists, we can use that to our advantage.
Mitch?
Well, I can say with certainty that the Americans do crave Canadian identity in certain situations. In the war in Iraq, I was tackled to the ground almost for Canadian pins, Canadian buttons, by U.S. reporters. They all wanted to be Canadians as we went into Baghdad. But, you know, I do think that in some respects it's probably a bigger challenge in a situation like that for a U.S. reporter. We do have a distinct advantage. However, as that conflict played out, you saw how the U.S. perspective was different from the one we brought back. And probably the sharpest example I can think of is the story, some of you might remember, the story of Private Jessica Lynch, who, you know, it was in the period of shock and awe, and
Take 30 seconds, remind everybody what that was
the
about.
U.S. military broke the story initially that there was a special forces raid into the town of Nasiriyah to rescue this captured soldier, Jessica Lynch, who was brutally treated by the Iraqis. Dramatic raid in a hospital, you know, perfect movie material, saving Private Lynch. And there was no appetite to follow up on that story once Baghdad fell and more journalists came in. And so I was working, we usually work in groups in hostile environments like that. You partner up in the buddy system for security. And so I talked it over with my partner, who's a British reporter, Inigo Gilmore, and we thought it was worth burning a day or two and spending some gas and going down to Nasiriyah and sniffing around to see what if everything matched up there. And we independently ended up interviewing 9 of the Iraqi hospital staff. The doctors there spoke English at Nasiriyah Hospital. The story was antithetical to how it was first advertised. There was no Iraqi military presence at that hospital. There was no need for a raid, and Jessica Lynch herself got the best available care that they had. And the evidence for that was the fact that this was in sanctions era, the sanctions era, so there was one available titanium shunt to repair a badly broken leg. There were a whole range of Iraqi soldiers badly mangled who needed it. They put it in Jessica Lynch. And ultimately we were able to confirm that she has Saddam's titanium shunt in her leg. And, you know, even after we broke the story, there was very little interest in the U.S. media to pick up on that. So to this day, that trope endures. Jessica Lynch was dramatically rescued by the Americans.
Now, that's a story you might not have got had you been an American journalist, so being a Canadian might have helped. Were there repercussions to you for telling that story?
Well, actually CNN picked up on it and sent a car to get me out of bed in Baghdad at 5 in the morning to go on with Aaron Brown, who was the predecessor of Anderson Cooper, if you remember. But Aaron got fired right after that, so I don't know how much of a contribution that was, and the Anderson Cooper era dawned on America.
It's been some interview.
Who knows?
So we have you to blame for Anderson Cooper.
I doubt it. You're welcome.
Okay, Kevin, your turn.
I guess I'm going to have to say it's a disadvantage, but that's within my own particular context, which is sort of walking the corridors of power, primarily in Washington, occasionally at various summits around the world. And in this context, it's very much a pecking order, and it sort of echoes what Tony was saying and a bit what Diana was saying also. I mean, Canada doesn't really, in that context, Canada doesn't really count. So when a Canadian economics reporter knocks on the door of the Treasury Department in the US, they don't have any particular reason to speak to me because their message is to the Wall Street Journal, to the New York Times, to the Financial Times, and then beyond that, that's their primary audience, but then beyond that, they care about getting their message out to the corners of the international economy where they want to influence the message. So of course, they want to speak to Chinese journalists, they want to speak to German reporters these days. Canada's just not there. So as a result, I'm sort of left reading the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and calling CG and trying to figure out what's going on. But I hear a lot of it must help out in the field, out away from places like Washington, to be able to walk into places where you don't carry that American flag, which means so many things in so many different places. I do see how that could be a benefit because you really are a neutral player. But when you're trying to cover the power game and the country to which you're reporting doesn't have a heck of a lot of power, you're sort of on the outside looking in.
I wonder if this is a question of timing. I mean, had you had the job you have back in the late 1980s when free trade agreements were being negotiated, maybe you would have been a bigger player, if I can put it that way, at the time?
I can only speculate, and maybe Tony or Mitch might have had some more experience around that than I have. My guess is yes. I mean, if you are involved in the cut and thrust, if you're involved in some sort of negotiation in which the U.S. has a significant stake, or the government of the day is involved in international affairs, the current government happens to have chosen not to have such an active role in international affairs, at least on the economic side. The previous government was more involved. So in that case, I would expect that maybe a Canadian journalist would have an avenue into getting access to US officials or officials from other countries or at the International Monetary Fund or wherever. So yes, maybe, but I can't say for certain, but probably.
Mitch, do you?
Well, we had free trade then, but we have Keystone XL now.
Right.
And so, the Romney campaign has just come out with a video called Day One. And the first item on that video, that's his agenda for the Romney presidency, should it dawn, and he is sworn in next January, is to approve Keystone XL. So we're in this surreal situation where we're entangled in one of the most important election issues in my working days can I remember that.
Does that get your calls returned if you call the Romney campaign?
It can. It depends on how you approach them, but it sure triggers interesting reactions when you go out and talk to Americans. I just did a 2,800-mile road trip, zigging and zagging from the Saskatchewan border down the route of Keystone XL to sort of take the pulse and get people's sense of it. And the reactions ran the gamut, but people were perplexed that we don't have refineries on our side of the border. Why would you want to send it down? You could have more jobs in Canada. And others are just incredibly head over heels gung-ho for that pipeline. I would say predominantly they are. But they have a lot of time for Canadian journalists right now.
Tony?
I think there are two aspects to Canadian journalists covering the world for Canadians. One clearly is to cover the Canadian angle, which only we Canadians care about. But I think another challenge, which I think is no less important, is to cover the world, such as it is, from a Canadian perspective, which may have no Canadian angle to it. So I think the strength, dare I say, of both Mitch and Kevin, and I can think of others who work out of Washington, is that they take a kind of what I call a high helicopter approach to quote-unquote America, which you would never get in the American media, God bless them, including the high-quality American news media, because I think Canadians, and I think the same thing applies often to, you see it in The Guardian, the British take on the US, it's a different take, and I think it's incredibly important that both are offered to Canadians, because I think that if we as Canadians have to rely on the New York Times to get the inside scoop of what's going on, and then rely on the Globe or the CBC or the Toronto Star to get the Canadian angle, then I think that's not a full kind of package. So
Let's spend some time on this. Diana, to you first. We obviously all have biases or opinions that mostly we keep to ourselves or try to when we're out there in the field reporting. And here I'm actually not even thinking left-wing versus right-wing. I'm thinking that as Canadians, we are more predisposed to see the benefits of multiculturalism than, say, people in France would be. Or we are more predisposed to see the benefits of a single-payer healthcare system than, say, many people in the United States would be. How do those kinds of attitudes affect coverage when you're in a different place?
Well, I think what Canadians consider institutional fairness or an institutional access to rights factors into the way you write things. Because you know what the Canadian expectation is. Canadian expectation is equal access to healthcare, to education, to what people would advertise as the Canadian dream. And so you filter what you're seeing through that prism. Where it doesn't exist to you is a contrast between what Canadians expect and enjoy and what other people are experiencing. But in subtle ways, it can affect the way you're doing your job as well. And it recalls for me an experience, this is years ago now, probably 12 or 14 years ago now, doing a story down in the United States about gun control. And it was in particular about legislation that was being talked about that would track back responsibility for the use of a gun to the gun manufacturer. And so we went down to a gun show, a huge gun show, unlike anything I've ever seen for any trade in Florida. And we had to use a freelance crew. Our own crews were busy in Washington at the time, and so there's always a roster of people you can pick up. And I think it was a Canadian sound person we had, but an American cameraman, something like that. Anyway, so we went to this gun show. Putting aside my opinions on guns or gun control, the fact is I've never shot one. Except once doing a story about military training, and I hurt my shoulder because I forgot that it kicks back, and that's the memory I had. And so there was a scene where they were showing me this tremendous new gun that clearly was just designed to bring down a rhino or an elephant or something, but it was to protect you at home. And I was holding it. And I remember, I felt awkward. I honestly wasn't sure which end was the shooting end of this gun. So I wasn't intentionally trying to look awkward, but I was clearly ticking off the American member of this crew. And I was focused on the fact that, we had a quick scene to do and I'm trying to do my thing. So at the end of the day, it clearly had bothered him all day. And we were at dinner and he just went off on Canadians. And if Americans hadn't taken up arms, they'd be praising the Queen too. And it went like this. And you realize that, what I thought of was a completely natural Canadian reaction to a setting to him was offensive. In the same conversation, the same dinner, as everybody piped down and quieted down, he talked to the Canadian, again, I can't remember sound man, cameraman, which one they were. This Canadian was helping him get cheaper pharmaceuticals because his son had a chronic illness. And for me, that was everything laid on one plate. So you do see things through your own prism. He was seeing things his way and I was seeing mine my way. And yet we were looking at the exact same circumstances. It wasn't a crisis where we had to choose sides. It was actually a pretty benign event. But it laid on the table that we did see things differently because of where we are from.
Tony, when you were running CBC National News, how difficult was it to take Neil MacDonald's sneering references to various things that would have been completely inconsistent with his, values out of his copy? I'm being a little provocative for the heck
No,
of it.
I can't wait to hear this.
Look, I've spent half my career defending the integrity and quality of Neil MacDonald, and I don't intend to stop now. Okay. But I do think, if I can use, citing Neil MacDonald, I think one of his benefits, to pick up or repeat one of his benefits in Washington is that he does take a very kind of unique take on this kind of country called the U.S., and I think that's helpful to us as viewers or readers in trying to understand, because I think there's a lot of inside baseball of all countries, not only the U.S., but I spent 3 years with my 4 years at Al Jazeera, 3 years in Qatar, but my final year was in Washington, and I was appalled at how the quality of both the media and the political discourse really has sunk I felt like Rip Van Winkle kind of returning. I was only gone for 3 years. And I think that really does, to those of us in Canada, i.e. neighbors of our American cousins, I think it's really important for us to get a take on what's going on in that society that you can't always get from even the best quality American reporters.
I mean, to jump on that point, I would say, I'm a terrific fan of Neil's and have been for a very long time. And part of what I've liked about his reporting is the very fact that he's reporting from another country on what's happening there. And I think that it has given him, and to his credit, he's taken it, the license to be more editorial about what he's observing. If Neil were reporting from Ottawa, that would be more complicated, I think. Because of the style of the way he tells a story. But he tells it as he sees it, which is the journalist's job.
Yeah. Mitch, you report for what some people in Canada, and no doubt what many red state Americans would call the Toronto Red Star.
The Toronto Red Star, yes.
So when you're reporting on events, let's say surrounding the Republican presidential freak show / nomination, do you... Sorry. Is that my outside? Was that really my outside voice that said that? Do you have difficulty keeping what may be, certainly your publishers or your editors or your own, disgust for what you're seeing out of the copy?
Well, after weeks and weeks of it, I had colleagues who were emailing me saying, you need cleansing, you need some kind of purge thyself. In theory, there's a Chinese wall. There's the editorial writers, and then there are those of us in the field who are trying to mop it up. But invariably, I'm sure it all seeps into our pores and out of our pores, and my perspective is my perspective. I try and get it right and be fair, but, part of this, refer again to this Keystone XL road trip. At one point in southern Nebraska, I prearranged a meeting with a landowner that I knew was pretty in favor of this pipeline, but he showed up in his pickup truck at the prearranged time in his patch of land with a loaded .357 Magnum on the seat beside him, and he had a bunch of printouts, and he thrust them through the window in my face and said, "Here, this is the truth." And it was stories by Chuck Norris for the WorldNetDaily.com. And so I was pretty taken aback, and I could see that revolver, and I said, well, this really must be the truth. Thank you very much. Very, very grateful for this. Do you have any more truth? But I guess, when Canada is nothing if not 30 million experts on the United States. We all know that. And I was one of them. And then you go there and you find out, wait a minute, this is actually more complicated than I thought. It's more nuanced. I have close friends that I worked with in the Middle East. We depended on each other our lives, and they've now finished their posting there. One of them lives in Boston and works for public radio there, and he takes it upon himself to apologize for his countrymen. I'm sorry you had to go to that Republican freak show, I guess what I try and do is hold it up and say, explain it to me like I'm from Mars. Tell me why you feel the way you do. And the guy with the .357 Magnum looked at me and he said, you are from Mars.
Kevin, what do you do in these circumstances?
I have to say I'm, to a degree, isolated from a lot of this because business audience, I'm picking this out of the context of the hyper-polarization that has occurred in Washington. You know, the business audience wants to know what's likely to happen. Fortunately, or unfortunately, that's left me with a lot of time to come up with other ideas in Washington because nothing is going to happen. So I've spent more time just writing about economic theory and Greece and lots of other things. But I think what Canadians need to bear in mind is that it's tempting to look at these people in the Republican primary as insane, and a fair case could be made that they are, but they take themselves very seriously, and there are people behind these candidates who are very serious about the views that not just Romney, obviously, but the whole field are putting forward. And so I think you have to avoid dismissing them just because you think it's nuts and nothing that comes from your background or context or anything you've ever heard in any of your days working in Ottawa or anywhere else, and accept that for whatever reason, and that might be the more important thing that we have to do as Canadian journalists down there, is trying to understand why people think this way. And that's a difficult thing to do, and it requires getting out of Washington, which I don't get to do as much as I would like, so I won't stray too far down that path. But I think we do have to resist the urge to think that, you know, the U.S. has turned into some kind of crazy freak show. I mean, you know, these people, you know, the guy that thrust this stuff in Mitch's face, I mean, it would have been nice if he'd, you know, read the Star and the Globe and BBC and Al Jazeera and watched some stuff that Diana does and had a bigger sweep of what's going on in the world. But he put some serious effort into educating himself, or at least he thinks he's educated himself on a subject. So I think you have to give that kind of person some credit, and you have to give the kind of political politicians that rise up around these ideas credit. If maybe you have to resist giving them the benefit of the doubt, but you know, you have to treat them seriously.
Tony, I want you to help us just kickstart a little discussion now about when you are out in the field, who are you thinking of as your audience that you're reporting to back home? And I'm thinking now, when you're running CBC National News, this is such a huge, diverse country.
Yeah.
You know, Western Canada, Central Canada, Quebec, the Maritimes, the North, you know, religious people, not religious people, Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people. The country is so diverse. And when you're trying to put a 2-minute piece together, who are you kind of aiming it at?
Well, I mean, you're not, obviously with the brevity of television and sadly the reduction, I think, of airtime being devoted to international news, and I suspect in some newspapers the amount of space, you can't you know, you got to be fairly cut and dried, you know. I don't, when I worked abroad with the CBC, I mean, as a field producer with Brian Stewart over many years, I mean, we clearly had a Canadian audience in a general sense, but I think if anything, my recollection of the challenge was, and to pick up on Mitch's point, was to understand the story we are covering in a way that's understandable and accessible to Canadians who would be inclined to, in our case, watch our coverage. I mean, I think as time went on, and I'm even more of this view, I feel that there's not enough time in a lifetime to convince 35 million Canadians that what's happening in the world is relevant to them. I actually think that belief, but if 30 million Canadians choose not to, then God bless them. What I have to do as a Canadian journalist, and what I expect of the Globe, of the Star, the CBC, is give me a kind of a quality of coverage that I, the reader, the viewer, the listener, who is inclined to be interested generally in that subject, but not necessarily have the kind of background that our field journalists would have. They want to understand it, you know. And I think in that sense, you're really not picking off niche audiences. I think where the diversity of Canada kicks in would be your story choice. You know, I think there has been over the years a broadening of the kinds of international stories that would interest a Canadian audience, And that, I think, is a respect for the diversity of the Canadian audience, you know? In other words, you don't cover, in the UK, you don't simply cover UK politics. In the UK, whether it's the evolution of Scotland, whether it's their struggle with multiculturalism, whether it's the problems of their National Health Service, you know, all of these issues, which are far more than simply the standard, you know, what's happening to the Prime Minister and what's going on in Westminster in the UK. And I think that as the years went by, and I speak both as somebody who was the bureau chief of London and certainly kind of supervised it afterwards, we broadened our agenda. And I think probably the reason we did that was a greater awareness in the diversity of the audience that we are in fact serving. You know, how well we did, I think, depends on the day.
Yeah.
You
Diana,
know, but we tried.
you're serving a national audience as well, coast to coast to coast. Do you know who it is you're serving and whether it's an audience or a multitude of audiences?
I mean, in some moments, to be frank, I have, you know, two people in the audience in mind at the same time.
Who are they?
One would be my boss. The other would be my mom. and not for reasons you might expect, but my mother is an immigrant who made her life here, has lived here now most of her life, has an interest in Germany, because that's where she came from, has a world view, but has to be talked into being interested in a story that takes an international view. And so I realized my task in talking to her and many others like her is to tell her why this matters, why this one. This one's in the newscast tonight for a reason.
And you literally think of your mom when you
I do,
script.
because she's a hard sell. But I'm also thinking about my boss or bosses who, you know, like Tony, are well-traveled, have reported around the world, who have that frame of thinking already. I don't have to convince them why this is an important story. I have to make sure that the story is not so simplified in the attempt to tell people why it's important, that it's meaningless to people who already have a framework to understand the story. So it's about trying to get the blend. You're trying to speak to a wide audience. And sometimes it's incredibly difficult in a 40-second VO about what happened today in Syria to manage the expectations of an informed audience and an audience that still isn't quite sure what's going on there. And so I do find that that's in my mind a lot of the time about trying to manage those two things. But beyond that, I mean, Canada is a remarkably multicultural world. And so many of the people that you're talking to do have an international frame of thinking. They have either been born here and are first generation Canadians or have somewhere in the world stood in line to get here. And so they understand very well Canada's role in the world and its place in the wider canvas. And so I think I would argue that we are more mindful of that when we are picking the stories and telling our stories than Americans might be.
Mitch, I wonder if you have a bit of an advantage insofar as you certainly have the diverse audience that you have to deal with, ethnically speaking, but the vast majority of the people eyeballing your work are going to live in the Greater Toronto area. Does that give them a more singular identity as an audience for you?
I think it does. I mean, you know, I think of my parents too, of course, and I know they're logged in online right now, so I have to say that. My mom's from Saskatchewan, and she's one of 19 brothers and sisters. So in some ways, I think the audience is my family. And my dad's a Newfoundlander, so I feel I have a pan-Canadian sensibility. But no, in Toronto, you know, the great city, big city dailies are moving toward extinction. And knock on wood that Toronto is an exceptional city that's supporting 4 dailies still to this day. Name me another. It's extraordinary. So there's still an appetite for a wide variety of printed news and the digital web that we're growing at the same time. What is wonderful about our commitment to international news is it's demanded by our readership. And I just spent the past 2 days at our office in hostile environment training. Maybe that's going to be about the next G20 in Toronto, but I have a feeling it's probably about conflict outside of Canada. And so we'll be deploying a lot more reporters besides myself, as we regularly do. It's demanded by the audience, and I think of the great big city dailies like the Chicago Tribune, like the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Baltimore Sun that won foreign reporting Pulitzers over the years and broke major stories, and they've crumbled. They've just crumbled now. They've shut it all down. And if you read the latest New Yorker, what you'll hear about the New York Times right now is frightening. So we live in an exceptional city. I left it 10 years ago to go on foreign assignment. And as I got to see more of the world and learn more about the world, the rarity of the plurocratic life that you have in Toronto, to ride the TTC, to ride the Spadina bus, I craved that. I craved it when I lived in Jerusalem, where the color of your skin and what you wear defines who you are, and to just be the whole world together in one place is. I mean, we used to build what? The big giant egg, the Sky Dome, and the CN Tower to tell ourselves we're world class. The reason it's an extraordinary city is the people.
Kevin, you want to follow up?
Again, I guess I have to come at this from where I approach, my journalism every day, and that is writing for sort of an audience whose idea first is business, investing, how what they read can make them money or inform their investing decisions. And in this way, I find that while there's still, I may, if I'm writing about the Federal Reserve, for example, may, use the Bank of Canada as a foil to, or as context to help explain, the latest policy decision by the Fed. I find really I'm more and more writing just for a international investing audience, and I didn't really realize that was happening, or that was really that mattered until during the debt ceiling fiasco last summer in Washington, when I was invited on a radio program in New Delhi, who wanted the Canadian correspondent in Washington to tell them about what was going on in Washington. I found that sort of extraordinary. I was traveling and unable to do it in the end, but I just felt it very strange and sort of showed me how information is shifting, that these people would reach out just to somebody. I guess they must have Googled debt ceiling fiasco and my name popped up and they thought that was good enough, but they they weren't going to the New York Times or the Washington Post or
But
whatever.
seriously, do you know why they wanted you?
I have no idea.
No idea?
Well, I'm sure it was the quality of my reporting on the fiasco.
Well, let me pick up on that, because we're getting questions starting to come in from the online audience, and they ask, and Tony, start this off if you would. An objective press, the person writes, helps maintain an objective populace. Can this be possible in the U.S. with the polarity that exists in the press and their political parties?
I think the answer is yes. I think it's difficult. I wouldn't exaggerate the polarity that exists in the press, in the sense that I think we're very familiar with Fox and MSNBC. The reality is that Fox, at any given moment, even its peak, for example, Bill O'Reilly, would have an audience of no more than 2 million people in a country of 300 million people. We in the press focus on Fox, but there still, I think, is a whole tradition of high quality print in particular. I don't have much regard for the TV coverage, but I guess the one thing, on the U.S. issue, and I totally agree with the consensus that this has been a freak show up to this point in the U.S., but things go in waves, and the pendulum will swing back. I was in Qatar, in Doha, in 2008, in charge of Al Jazeera English, which is a staff of about 1,000 people, 50 nationalities. The single question that was asked of me the most in 2008, as we planned and executed the coverage of Barack Obama's rise in far-off America. The question asked of me as the kind of in-house North American, in spite of the fact they keep saying that I'm actually a Canadian, is how could this happen? And they said it in awe. They said it with incredible respect at the uniqueness of the American political process. How can a country, and this is how they phrased it, I embrace this question as well, how can a country that for 8 years would elect George Bush turn around and flirt with the prospect of electing Barack Hussein Obama, a black American? And I spent much of my time trying to explain what I think most of us who love the U.S. as much as we find it annoying. There's a vibrancy to that political culture. So I think as awful as the freak show has been up to this point, and hopefully as the election approaches in November, it'll get a bit saner. But I have a feeling that if we can fast forward 2 or 3 or 5 years from now, that the U.S., the pendulum will swing back to a political and a media culture that is a bit more tolerant of diversity than it appears to be right now.
I would jump in
go
on
ahead.
just to say briefly that I think that while it may be polarized or more polarized than it is here, at least people are engaged. Yeah. They argue, they discuss, they have sharp opinions. They're engaged in their political process in a way that I don't think we are at our peril. And I think maybe it's because we are all trying to be too fair, too polite. I don't want to throw objectivity under the bus. But I think that sometimes you swing too far in the pendulum and you lose something in between.
Our politics are more polarized now, though, aren't they, than in many, many years? Doesn't it seem to be?
Yeah, but I think
Am I wrong
you've
about
moved
this?
degree from here to here, and we're talking about a contrast that's somewhere over here.
For the U.S. Mitch?
Unless you're talking about the Toronto Red Star versus the Mayor Ford, then maybe it won't. That seems more American, I think.
That was actually going to be my next question. Well, why do you hate the mayor so much?
I haven't lived here in 10 years, so I have no idea. I think the issue is, and I think there's a lot more criticism in the U.S. now of the coverage, not so much on polarity as it is on triviality. And I find it really fascinating that in the last 2 weeks, the dominant scandals have been the fact that Romney was a bully in high school and what variety of marijuana Obama smoked in Hawaii 40-odd years ago. And it has nothing to do with the issues at hand and the multiple crises that the country is trying to navigate its way through.
In fairness, I think the Obama dope story was a one-day story, and even though the Washington Post
Maybe
gave
so,
front-page coverage to the bullying, it disappeared after a few
It
days.
was the triviality du jour, though, and there's a lot of that in the sort of 24/7 digital echo chamber. And I can only reference, I do remember being a cub reporter, and there would be sort of a senior figure in the newsroom who would look at these sort of candy cane stories and say, we got to have that in the paper, but not on page 1. That'll go on page 7, and it'll be the little bit of candy people can have, and they'll get there and they'll read it. And that person no longer exists, and I think it's been replaced by all of us clicking away. And when we see the candy, we click through on it, and it becomes the most viewed item on every single website out there. And you can't go back into the news meeting the next morning and say, we shouldn't have a follow-up on that candy when it drove traffic at a multiple of 10 of all the other stories that you covered that had meat. And I think that's a sad evolution. There's so many other things I love about digital media, and it's a thrill for me as the guy who used to be working on tomorrow's news yesterday sort of thing, to actually be competing in real time with my electronic peers and have comments on stories as they happen. But I think it's very sad that, maybe another analogy is that, you used to consume your news at a newsstand at Leichmann's in Toronto where people would notice if you went to and filled your arm with the tabloids, with the National Enquirer, and walked to the cash register. And nobody sees you do that when you click through. So we get this sort of water cannon of Tiger Woods style scandal stories like never before.
Kevin?
I think it's more of a resources issue in the U.S. than an objectivity issue necessarily. I think even Fox would attempt to suggest that it's objective. You do see from time to time the other perspective on the air, but the problem really is that, and this is what Mitch was talking about earlier, is that so many newspapers, which were sort of the core of objective portrayal or an attempt to sort of give a broader view of what's going on, so many of these newspapers have just been decimated. Some of them barely exist, some of them don't exist at all. The reporters that are left are just struggling to stay afloat every day, keep up with what's going on Twitter, on Facebook, in sort of the 24-hour cable universe, which is sort of driven by headlines and ephemera that they don't really care what happens tomorrow. They just want to, win the day or win even the minute or the whatever. And so in that context, it sort of amplifies the story of the moment, because you're under pressure. If you're sitting in a newsroom, whether it's in Baltimore or Philadelphia or where have you, and cable and Twitter and everybody's talking about what kind of weed Obama smoked, you're thinking, my God, I have to do that too. And so it just amplifies the stuff that doesn't matter, and there just aren't enough people left to write about the stuff that does, and to make the case to the editors who ultimately have to decide what they're going to do, to say, well, this is more important than, Romney bullying somebody back in high school.
Gotcha.
You just can't do it. There's nobody there to make that case, because they don't have the time to, actually put together a good story.
Let's do one more go-round, one more question up here, and then we'll get the audience involved. So those of you who want to ask questions, and I know this is a Canadian audience and nobody wants to go first, but somebody out there be bold. Microphones on either side. You can start to line up now. We'll do one more up here. I'm wondering, Diana, you first. When you're reporting abroad, do you take some comfort in the knowledge that the people you are reporting on almost certainly will not be seeing your finished product? And does that therefore give you license to do some things you might otherwise not do?
Yes, it does, and it used to be true.
Not so true anymore.
No, the internet's out there. I can tell you, as an investigative reporter, they Google your name. You arrive for the interview, and everybody's waiting for you to attack. You can't even sort of gently get into the interview, because they're waiting for it, because that title alone has shot you in the foot, frankly. So it's difficult that way in terms of even advancing to the interview, never mind the finished product. I think at one time, it did allow a kind of a freedom, because you didn't expect the person to see the story, and so you weren't worried about the backlash. Didn't mean that you took incredible license or that you were free to get it wrong, but you weren't afraid to tell the story either, because you weren't worried about these people coming after you. By further extension, it's always in extremes. Depends where you're reporting from. There were always minders, and I'm sure Tony can give you a better sense of that experience than I can. But I think that there was a time when reporters felt freer to tell a story outside of a real crisis zone and be really honest about it. Now they know that it can come back, and it's not that you're worried about that government or that person necessarily really pursuing you, but it makes it more difficult for the next person going back. The next time you're sending a crew into that place to try to do a story, there is a footprint left behind now that maybe wasn't so pronounced before.
Tony?
No, I agree with what Diana was saying. I think it's hard to generalize. I think that, if anything, I think the license that I'm familiar with, that one would take being abroad and covering the story for a Canadian audience, is that you can tell it with a wider perspective. You can tell it almost more like a magazine treatment. Depending on whether you're dealing with political people, you don't really have the worry that they're going to come back to you and say, look, you've sullied my reputation among my voters. So I think you have a creative freedom. I definitely agree with Diana that it's not a question of taking license with facts or with perspective, but you don't have you're not going to get an email the next morning, chances are. There won't be that kind of nattering local pressure to your boss and all of that kind of thing. And I think that often liberates you in giving an angle to a story that perhaps you wouldn't be able to do if it was a domestic story where kind of everybody's there in front of you.
Kevin, any evidence you got that anybody in Washington ever reads anything you ever write?
I would love the Fed to phone me one day and say, you got that wrong, but they never have.
Hasn't happened yet?
Doesn't happen. As probably everybody on the panel can attest, the press or the press minders or the press branches of the administration are getting incredible or more and more aggressive. So if you did write something that the administration didn't like, no matter where you're from, they'll get on you quickly and hard. But my experience is that as long as you're basically respecting the facts and not making too big a leap that, for the reasons that I talked about earlier, I'm not really, it's not worth their trouble to try to badger me into a clarification or correction. I mean, I'm much more concerned about what the Wall Street Journal has to say or some of these others.
Right. Mitch, let me make it more specific for you. You've reported from Israel.
Yeah.
We have a large Jewish community, not large, but we have an influential Jewish community in this country, which when it tends to read things or see things or hear things in Canadian media, responds. Have you had any experience with that?
I should show you the scar tissue. Bless my editors, they said, we got your back, just be fair, tell us what you see. And so I think I was in the minority of reporters who cover that conflict, who have a completely free hand to tell what they see. I know reporters, I'm not going to name names because it'll get them in trouble, but I know reporters from major American news organizations who basically would offer others stories that they weren't allowed to get in the paper.
And they weren't allowed to because?
Well, in one instance, it was too sympathetic to the Palestinian side of the story. Look, I was mindful, I got hate from all sides, and very little love, let me tell you. And I'm glad it wasn't, I left in 2008, and I pity the people that work there now, because the water cannon is even more intense, I think, just because of the way digital communication technology has even evolved in those years. But it amassed, it was so closely watched. So
you wouldn't have heard anything necessarily from an Israeli audience when you were over there, but you'd sure hear because this question comes from online, you'd hear about it from the diaspora audiences.
I'd hear about it from the diaspora audiences, and eventually advocacy groups like honestreporting.ca came up and took turns picking on the Canadian journalist who got it wrong in their view, but only if they got it wrong from an Israeli perspective. It wasn't, kind of an even brokered, if you cross either line, we have to call you out. But I was also mindful of the fact that I think there are an awful lot of anti-Semites cheering on the Palestinian cause. And so, in your soul, you have to ask yourself, what's the right way to go here? I mean, I'm trying to tell the story, but am I feeding monsters out there? And the message for my editors, I think, was correct. It's, we got your back, ignore all this stuff. You're not going to do yourself any favors dwelling upon it. Just be a journalist, and be a good one.
Great. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you right now. If you like, tell us who you are. If you have anybody in particular you want to direct the question to, let's do that too. Is that somebody over there? If you would, get it started, please.
Thank you.
Whoops, microphone on, please. Go ahead.
My name is Samuel Moshani, undergraduate student at the University of Guelph.
Hi,
I'm
Samuel.
a little bit worried about the new paywalls that are being proposed by the large news outlets like the Globe and Mail and Post Media, where after you view a certain number of articles every month, you're going to be required to pay an online subscription. And I'm wondering if the topic today was bordered biases, if the panelists see that creating online subscription fees will result in those with fewer resources having access to less resources and less points of view, and if this will result in polarization or if this will result in unequal access to opportunity among different groups in society.
Hold the phone. Kevin, your paper's playing around with this. Do you want to go first here?
Sure, but I'm sure Mitch's paper must be playing around with it too. But
They haven't told us yet.
Paywalls. I'm going to have to say that I understand the reservations very much, but I think that the end result will be better journalism, because if the current trend continues, there's just not going to be any reporting resources left in too many news organizations. I'm not going to say news reporting is not going to go away, but strong newspaper reporting will be severely diminished, and you'll the newspapers left standing will be like the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, a few of these publications. They can kind of lean on a built-in business audience, but as far as more mainstream general newspapers, they need to find a way to bring the revenue back. So I don't know if readers instead went out and started buying GMs again, or all these people who used to advertise with newspapers, and when they were on the lot told them, well, I saw that ad in the Globe and Mail, so that's why I'm here. I mean, that might avoid a paywall, but that's not happening for whatever reason. So I think paywalls are, I guess papers like the Globe have to try and see if that brings. I think we recognize that the risk is that yes, we'll lose some readership, but that readership isn't generating any money for the Globe and Mail to underwrite the sort of journalism that it wants to do. So without that revenue, I mean, we can't do much of anything but be the Huffington Post.
Mitch, is the Star going to do this too?
I don't know. I mean, I remember as a little kid, we had rabbit ears on our black and white television, and so TV was free. Not like in the UK where you pay your annual fee. You absorb it. And somehow the genius of Rogers and Friends to convince us all to pay this large monthly bill. So I cling to this idea that somehow a little bit of that genius exists to rescue and save the Globe and Mail and the Star and Post Media and all the rest, and that we find the formula to somehow monetize what is trading dollars for pennies. It's a broken business model, and I don't know anybody that has the answer.
Tony, I know you're not in the newspaper game, you're in the television game, but you write a weekly column now for the Toronto Star. Can any business give it away for nothing and survive?
No, and I find this whole paywall debate strange in that 2 or 3 years ago when it started, and I think it was it the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember who, I think it's inevitable we're heading there in the same way that it's inevitable when we walk into a newsstand, none of us feels that we can take a magazine off the rack or a newspaper off the rack without paying for it. Otherwise, one figure I remember from my year in DC, because I was on various panels, the United States of America, 300 million people, they now have fewer than 100 foreign correspondents attached to large mainstream news organizations. The US, arguably the world's most important country from the point of view of needing a population that understands the world. And that's a reflection of the fact the business model is broken, to echo my two colleagues here. And I think the only way to fix it is for those of us who value this kind of information to pay for it. And there are various creative ways of doing it. I think in terms of diversity, which is a key issue, I think there are a lot of ways, thanks to the internet and thanks to the web and thanks to the creativity, particularly of young people, to get around that. But the reality is that even with paywalls, the younger generation today has far greater access to diversity of information than I had when I was in college. And I think the fact that the number of so-called foreign correspondents from Canadian news organizations is dropping by the day, and in the US it's already underground, I think is an argument for some creative paywall solution. That will happen, whether we like it or not, it'll happen. Otherwise, these organizations will shut down, and I don't think any of us wants that.
I'll just jump in again. I hope the publisher's not watching, but these paywalls are leaky paywalls. To again build on what Tony's saying, I mean, you've probably already discovered that if you click on a link that somebody sent you via Twitter, you can read that story without having to worry about signing up with the Financial Times or whoever. I mean, and that's not necessarily an oversight or a glitch. News organizations want their stories out there for commercial reasons, but also because they have that ethic of wanting to reach an audience, wanting to set the terms of debate and that sort of thing. So I still have to think that there will be a diversity of views. I mean, if the information will get out there, it won't stay hidden behind these paywalls. I mean, I guess Huffington Post will probably get a Globe and Mail subscription and a Toronto Star subscription if it ever comes, and then regurgitate what we do on their site. But
I have Philip Crawley right here. He wants you in his office tomorrow morning.
That's why I refuse to go to the office tomorrow. I'm going back to DC.
This microphone up here, please.
Thank you. My name is Nicholas Marcagiani. I'm a student at the University of Waterloo. And first, I'd like to thank the panelists for this opportunity. My question has to do with a topic that was briefly touched on earlier, which is partisanship in media. I wonder if the panelists could share their thoughts on about the direction the Canadian media is evolving. Are we in danger of becoming more like the American political media? And I'd like to include the examples of Sun TV and Kevin O'Leary and characters like that. Thanks.
Okay, Diana, you first.
Thought maybe if I ducked, you'd go right over. I would argue that, when Sun Media was first posited as an idea, and it was advertised as a right-of-center point of view, my perspective at the time was, bring it on. The more the merrier. I have an appetite for every point of view, and I would rather hear it articulated by someone who really holds that point of view, believes strongly in it, for whatever reasons has landed there. That's the person I want to hear from, and I'll decide what I think after amalgamating all those points of view. So I had no problem with that. I don't necessarily know that that's what Sun TV is doing. And I'm reluctant to sort of attack them because I think it's been too easy to do. But along the lines of what Tony was saying about Bill O'Reilly and Fox News, the audience is still very small. So in terms of the impact they're having on the media landscape, while you'll have Pelado on the phone in seconds, I'm sure, I don't think it's been all that pronounced. Is there polarity in the news? I don't know if you're seeing it any more than you ever did. I will say this. In over 25 years as a journalist, I am aware now that I will get emails a lot quicker, or that I will get pushback a lot quicker from government, from people who are politicized, who are connected with the parties. If they don't like something, they're not shy. And that's fine. We're a public broadcaster. I am a public broadcaster. So if you don't like what I've said or what I've done, I can't shirk from that, and I'm prepared to defend it. But I do see that more and more people believe that you should be taking a point of view, and it's theirs. So I think that we need to be strong as journalists and commit to what we believe in, which is transparency and openness, objectivity, but reaching a conclusion when it's obvious to reach. And that's part of what an investigative journalist does. And Tony will talk about, we could talk about the CBC policy guide. An investigative journalist is allowed to reach a position based on an objective assessment of the fact. Sometimes people don't get that.
Tony, once upon a time, MSNBC was a more middle-of-the-road broadcaster than it is today. When it saw the success of Fox, and then when Obama came in, they obviously made a business decision to move further left for business reasons, for ideological reasons, whatever. We have Sun News now on television in Canada. Is there a business case to be made that maybe CBC News Network or CTV News Channel ought to move further left in order to differentiate themselves more?
I think the answer is no, as evidenced by the fact that there are probably more people on this panel than are currently watching Sun TV, in all opinions. Can I make a confession? I was on a global panel, and I used that joke before. I figure I can use it 3 times. No, let's face it, the audience, and I think it's a compliment to the discernment of Canadian public. I think the...
that they're not watching Sun? It's a discernment to the...
That they're not watching.
That they're not watching.
That they're not watching. I think, and that's something that I was actually, I think on CBC Radio, I think I was at Al Jazeera in Doha, and a bit like Kevin, I get this call out of the blue from some CBC show, I think it was in the middle of the night, about whether I thought Sun TV would catch on a la Fox. And my prediction then was no, and on this one, I think we've all proven correct. The one thing I must say about Fox, we should remember, because a survey that came out a couple of weeks ago that was the same results as a survey that came out a year ago, is in terms of the knowledge of the world and of America by Fox viewers. They classified different networks, and NPR, PBS, very high, New York Times. Then as they go down, there are the figure attached to doesn't watch any news is a certain number, and below that would be a viewer of Fox News. So and that is true, and I haven't used that joke before because it's not a joke, it's true. But I think I must say, and I say this aware that we've got the CBC, the Star, and the Globe, and I would include CTV in this, is that I think we do have news organizations still that see the distinction, whether it's as formal as a firewall. I mean, they see the distinctions between the news pages, news gathering, reporters, and columnists. And I think that generally, and that has not been the case in certain U.S. news organizations. So as long as the audiences insist that that's the way they should go, the news organizations, I'm confident that at least in this one respect that we're not going to go the way of the Americans. And I think the failure of Sun TV, I think, is an example.
Gotcha. This microphone, please.
I have a question about back to the online news. We're a household that used to get 2 or 3 papers a day 2 years ago, and now we don't get any. And everybody in our household, which includes university students, gets their news online, and I in particular have become a big fan of Twitter. And one of the reasons that I have found it such a wonderful space for news is the international aspect of it, but also the frustration that I and our household was feeling at the way newspapers were becoming just propaganda machines for various enterprises.
Name names.
I'm very interested in climate change. Now, if you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, or a lot of these papers have been completely irresponsible, unscientific, and very, very poorly reporting on climate news. And I believe it was because they were under pressure from advertisers and the people who pay for those things to not actually report. So I find the Twitterverse absolutely a fantastic environment for international news and what I would call real news and not propaganda. I know there's propaganda there, but if you have a mind, it's not too difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. I'd like your response to that.
Mitch, can you speak to I think the underlying premise here, which is that if there's enough subscriber pressure, we all know about the separation of church and state in the newspaper business. Mm-hmm. But if there's enough advertiser pressure, publishers put heat on editors, editors put heat on reporters, reporters write different stories. Yes or no?
Well, not in my experience, but I guess if we were guilty of that being the Red Star, we would be guilty of making her much happier by writing about climate change in a more in a way that would better suit her. The beauty of Twitter, and I'm trying my best to adapt and adjust to Twitter. I'm thrilled at what it is as a resource and a source, an alternate source for breaking news. I mean, I'm sorry it didn't exist when I was in the Middle East, because I'm just blown away at what I'm learning about Syria from people I've actually met and seen in Syria. In real time. It used to be a place of complete blackout, and it would be today if not for that fantastic tool. But I saw a tweet saying that the Assad family had flown out on an aircraft 10 days ago, and they didn't.
Funny, I didn't read that in your paper, though.
So I'm pretty suspicious of Twitter content, and it has to be verified for it to become real, and often it is, and that's fantastic.
Kevin, there are more and more people today who do not believe that your newspaper or any other newspaper still believes in this separation of church and state. You want to tell us whether it's true or not?
I think it still exists. I'm going to have to, I'll I guess, respond directly to the climate change issue. That's a tough one for a newsroom, especially a shrunken newsroom. If newsrooms were as big as they were a decade ago, I would expect the New York Times and many other news organizations would probably assign 2 or 3 reporters to follow that issue in an in-depth way on an ongoing basis. That luxury doesn't exist anymore. So editors and publishers are forced to allocate what limited resources they have to what they know the bulk of their audience is going to care about. And unfortunately, the bulk of the audience doesn't care about climate change, probably because, unfortunately, the world is warming up very slowly, and it's tough to show that in a dynamic way on a day-to-day basis. So you have to so you end up putting your resources on the stuff that's in everybody's face every day, whether it's, in the US right now, it has been the Republican primary, it now will become the election. Because that's the kind of stuff that's the stuff that drives Twitter traffic. That's the stuff that gets people coming to your website. Unfortunately, climate change stories just don't. If you had the time to do a really good one or a series of really good articles, that probably would. But unfortunately, the reporting power isn't out there to do that in any sort of way that you would feel like there was ongoing coverage of this issue.
Although if I could just quickly
Please.
add one more thought. I think your question is well taken. When you talk about the coverage in the United States of the climate issue, the most aggressive reporting happening right now is the Guardian's reporter, Susie Goldenberg, and she's on a dedicated beat. I'm not surprised because she was phenomenal when she lived in Jerusalem. She's a tremendously dedicated reporter, and you can read her free. It's not behind a paywall, although maybe they will be eventually at one point as well. It may be in the United States, when you look at the public opinion numbers, they're not moving on the climate issue at all. And having driven the route I just drove along those, they call them red states in the United States, but they have their political colors backwards. It's not liberal red, it's Republican red. That pipeline route follows states that will never vote for Barack Obama. He may get reelected in November, but it's not going to happen where the Keystone XL pipeline goes. Right. And a president, or even I think news organizations, can only move their readership so far on any given issue, or they become such outliers that people tune them out. Yeah. And I think possibly that's what they're afraid of. Is the Koch family foundation behind it? I don't know. They seem to be spending a lot of money on their own climate agenda without putting pressure on newspapers like the New York Times.
Right. Over here, please. Anybody there? Sorry, back over here.
My name's Matthew Kang. I'm a reporter here for CTV News. I was just curious. I've been working for about 4 years now here and in Germany. And I've noticed that a lot of my bosses or newsroom staff tend to be, white Anglo-Saxon Canadians or Canadians of European background. I'm just wondering what you would think coverage or editorial decisions would be like if the top team was, I guess a little bit more diverse in terms of ethnicity or sexual orientation or anything like that.
Tony, you get that one. You run a newsroom. Go ahead.
I think the decisions would be different. I think I think there have been efforts. I can speak directly about the CBC, but I know this has also been the case with other news organizations like the Globe, the Star. I think there's been a real effort in having the news organization, including the decision makers, as you're indicating, kind of reflect the diversity of society. It's not, you can't do it overnight, and it's a gradual thing. When I went from the CBC to Al Jazeera, it was amazing because in front of me there were 50 nationalities, so at all levels, but that again was not because of any great vision on the part of the Al Jazeera. It was just a reflection of the nature of its organization. In Canada, the tragedy of, because these news organizations, and I say this with great respect, are generally unionized, these various layoff waves, first in, last in, first out. So I think there have been a lot of efforts to build up the diversity of senior people. And I think to a great extent, I think they're growing into the jobs. I'm old enough to remember in the 70s where there was a great issue about women journalists, you know, and there was a disparity, and that if anything, that's totally flipped on its head now at all levels, you know, and that again took time. So, but I do think at the end of the day, we are human beings, and my experiences and what I see reflect my decisions. So I think it would be wrong for any manager, whether he or she is white or not white, to deny the fact that you know, a more diverse senior leadership would produce a wider range, I think, of stories and editorial material, and that ultimately, I think, should be the goal of every news organization, certainly in this country.
Let me try a very politically incorrect follow-up. I have discussed this issue with various people who are in a position to hire.
Yeah.
And I have heard all of them, to a person, say, I would love to hire an Aboriginal correspondent, can't find one who's qualified for the job. I would love to have a senior producer for documentary making who is an African Canadian, can't find you know, somebody who's qualified for the job. Are our journalism schools disproportionately made up of certain ethnic demographics and then not of other ethnic demographics, which makes the hiring harder?
Well, let me deal with that in two ways. I can't speak to journalism schools throughout the country. I can speak about Ryerson, and I can speak about the class that I taught, just finished, where there's incredible diversity, you know, through the university, through the School of Journalism, in the classroom. I do think that the explanation that you gave, which is a very familiar one to me, is a cop-out. The one thing I did learn, I learned many things in my 4 years at Al Jazeera. I also learned really that experience is not seniority. Seniority is seniority. God bless seniority, and we know why seniority is there. Experience is the experience of the individual. Could be at any age, could be coming from any background, at various levels of skill. And I actually have been part, with my colleagues when I was at the CBC, of hiring a multitude of, whether it's Aboriginal reporters, and in some cases it worked out, in some cases it didn't work out. I think in hindsight, and I share in the blame, I think sometimes when they didn't work out, we didn't know enough to provide the kind of support those individuals had. But I just think the effort has got to go, you know, there's also in various hiring boards, I can't remember if this is the CBC's practice anymore, where you can't go ahead with hiring without ensuring that the 4 or 5 or 6 people that are on the list are reflective of the society. In other words, you've got to just keep searching until you find X or Y or Z or W. And I think that's the only way to go. I think sometimes, and I think that, you know, and so many organizations are experiencing it, when you go through layoffs, that's where the whole place kind of freezes, and where you get into, you know, everybody's looking for their own. And that's where a lot of these initiatives are undermined, you know, but I think at the end of the day, there's got to be a constant aggressiveness about it, because otherwise we keep marching backwards.
Gotcha. Yes, over here, please.
My name's Janet Atchison. I live here in Waterloo. My question is about the Leveson inquiry in the UK, and I never thought I'd get a chance to ask this, but I was just sitting here thinking, well, I should go ahead and do this. Now, what are you thinking about? Are you talking about this in your workplace? It started out as something very specific around the issue of phone hacking, and it's become much more amorphous but fascinating to follow. And I'd be curious to know about the level of conversation and how this has impacted you in your work, if at all.
I'm going to have Diana start with that, because I think you newspaper guys are more one-man bands where you are, and there's not much water cooler chat. But is there water cooler chat about what Rupert Murdoch's facing right now in the whole hearings that are going on in Parliament in Britain?
Honestly, I think there was at the beginning of the revelations about how widespread the tampering was, and the conversation was often about how high do you think the knowledge went? Was it a few people who had the skills and the knowledge and the know-how to do this? Was there willful blindness on the part of management? Or, as it now seems, I think, clearly apparent, was management actually directing this practice and insisting on it at some level? I mean, I think that's where we were all kind of struck by it. I feel like I can say with a measure of authority, it just doesn't happen here. I've never even heard of an inkling of it, a rumor of it, a suspicion or suggestion. Not even the kind of competitive evil that some takes, where someone would say, well, I think they do it the other place. I've not heard of it at all. I simply don't think it does happen. I don't think there'd be a tolerance for it. But further, as we're hearing, Tony Blair at the inquiry this week and others talking about how genuinely fearful they were of Murdoch and that they were actually running their governments. I mean, it's astonishing to me to hear Tony Blair. I mean, I guess, credit to him for being as bold as he was, but to say that he was mindful of it is, I think, on one level disturbing and another a bit terrifying. And I don't know that there are any parallels. I think Rupert Murdoch has been singularly, in the democratic world, singularly so powerful and so influential that I'm not sure that there's a parallel anywhere else.
Mitch and then Tony.
I said nice things about The Guardian, so let me blast a big flaming hole in the rest of the British media or other parts of it now. I was based in the UK for a time, and it's just extraordinary to me to watch the British journalists, particularly in action. You think, we take it as a given that competition is a good thing, more competition is better, but the competition of the British press is so absolutely ferocious that they compete to get the story wrong, to go beyond what the story is, and twist and bend and spindle and manipulate it. And I've seen it time and time again in the field. I've been sharing rooms in places like Afghanistan with long-suffering writers for the Sunday papers, because the Sunday papers are the ones that have to go further. They have to go beyond what the weekday guys got. And they have editors on the end of the line saying to them, well, don't you think he really meant to say this? And they're changing the quotes and putting pressure on these writers to, can't we just kind of turn the dial up to this? And they kind of think of the headline first and work backwards from there. How much can we dial this up? So it's fascinating to us, but it's a craft thing, right? We're just, there's a Facebook group called Toronto Has-Beens and Never-Do-Wells that's a nexus point for those who've been downsized or retired and those of us still active in the field. And it's a constant conversation. The latest tick on whether Pierce Morgan was involved in this or not is fascinating to all of us.
He was, yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Tony, this looks not just unprofessional. Some of this looks downright evil, what they've been up to over there.
Yeah, it is evil. It's criminal. It's criminal, and I agree with Diana that there's no, and I can speak to my experience fairly long here, there's never been any suggestion. But there actually have been a couple of panel discussions here in Toronto involving journalists on the issue, so I think it's a great question. I think generally the debate that I recall is between those who argue that it could never happen here and those who argue that what is so bloody pure and perfect of Canadian journalists. I tend to fall in the latter camp, although I don't think any of us are going to flirt with criminal wrongdoing. But I think at the heart of what's going on in Britain is a reflection of just the desperation and the competitive desperation of the industry. And I think journalists are as flawed as any other species on earth. And if they're put under the guns by their budget people, that they've got to kind of go that extra kilometer, then they'll do it, and that's why there needs to be safeguards. That's why there'll be a whole series of safeguards that will be put into place in Britain, and I think the debate here in Canada is, should we flirt with some of them preemptively on the assumption that what happens in the UK will eventually happen in the US and God forbid happen here. So I don't think we're ever going to slip down criminality, because that was clearly against the law. But I do think the cutting of corners, the playing with angles, the doing things that will somehow boost circulation or audiences and your own career, brackets, I think is something that we're as vulnerable to as these idiots in London.
Microphone over here, please. Stand by, Daniel. Can we get this mic on over here, please?
Hello, I'm Daniel, and I'm an undergraduate student. And I wanted to ask, today, at today's panel, it was discussed the ideas of your audience and the Canadian perspective and who your readers are. And I just wanted to ask, what would objectivity mean to you? If you have all these different pressures, how do you remain objective? And what does objectivity mean for you, and how do you achieve it?
The eternal question. Go ahead, Kevin, start that out. We know you believe in stuff. How do you keep it out of your copy?
I guess objectivity means to me, I try to push past, let me backtrack, let me come at this question this way. I try to assess the agendas behind the information from whatever the source may be, push past all that, try to think about and understand the essential policy issue, since that's what I write about the most, the sort of the policy that is at play, and make as close to a fair and reasonable assessment about whether this particular policy has a chance of working, its merits, its flaws, that sort of thing. And because we really have entered this supreme era of spin, I essentially try to shove aside anything that's coming, say, from the Romney campaign or Ron Paul, I suppose more in my case, since I write about monetary policy a lot, or anybody's particular perspective, and try to understand the best I can from sort of neutral sources about what's at play. And I guess I probably come at reporting far differently than I was taught to, and that was, quote this side, quote that side, maybe quote somebody else. I find that I quote fewer people these days than I might have 10 years ago.
How come?
For the reasons I just sort of alluded to, in that I do think that we've entered this new era of media manipulation, so I don't really trust anything that I'm being told by an opposition party or the government.
And your editors are fine with that? They don't mind you quoting fewer people?
I'm sitting here, so.
You still are.
My editors are fine with that, because I think everybody recognizes that if there was a day where you could take what the government was putting in front of you at face value, that day is probably no longer here. Because there is such an aggressive attempt to get the message out. It's more about the message right now when you're covering governments than it is about what they're actually trying to do.
Diana, somewhere along the way, we were always taught, when I started out doing this 30 years ago, they always said objectivity, objectivity. And then somewhere along the way, I think the rule book changed and it said, we really don't know if objectivity is possible, let's just go for fair. Is that where it's at today?
I think it's a mix of both. I mean, my own perspective on it is that I think that all of my fiercely held beliefs are flawed. I just take that position. So talk me into the other position. Challenge my assumptions. Teach me something I don't know. And so I usually go into a story with the assumption that I could hear something I didn't see coming. It could even change my mind. And so my views aren't so closely, passionately, unshakably held that I can't find a way to exercise them out of the story that I'm doing.
You're open.
I'm open to it. I mean, because I think the most fascinating thing about journalism is the fact that you meet people and hear them say things that you just didn't expect. And it happens all the time. It happens every day. It's the best part about the job. You get to be a tourist all the time in all kinds of environments, in all kinds of worlds, and get to hear how other people think and why they've arrived at opinions. I mean, we heard it earlier, that people who could seem completely rational to you may hold what you think is a completely irrational view. But if they have a reason for holding the view, they have some sway with me. I have more time for that than people who borrow a point of view and couldn't possibly tell you why they hold it. So I think it's possible. It may sound harder than it is to keep your own personal views at bay, but if you believe in what journalism is, it's actually not as hard as it sounds.
And if you want to keep your job.
Well, that helps.
That helps too. Mitch, objectivity or fairness? Where's it at for you?
It's fairness is how I view it. I mean, I would have an easier time being fair to Adolf Hitler than objective in a story about Hitler. How would you be objective with Hitler?
I'd hope you'd rather be neither.
Well, fairness might involve zero quotes or...
But you're tasked to be. I mean, you're tasked to talk to people that sometimes you don't want to be in the same room with. Now, I recently spent an hour and a half interviewing a pedophile. Is that how I wanted to spend my morning? Not really.
Can I say a question?
You resist asking certain questions, but I did need to hear what he had to say, and I did try to understand it.
When you walked into that interview and you introduced yourself, did you shake his hand?
That's a good question. I don't think so. Because to be honest, and I'm saying, because I think that would have been weird, and you are very aware of yourself in the moment, but you're also very aware of how tense that moment is, because that interview, he didn't see me coming. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. And I surprised him. I introduced myself, said I wanted to talk with him. And we talked, as I say, for the better part of an hour and a half. But it was, it was a pretty strange interaction for an hour and a half. I was done by 8 in the morning, and I actually remember going back to my hotel and thinking everyone else I knew, my children, my children's friends, their parents, had had the regular morning. They got up, maybe they went for a run, they made somebody's school lunch. I had spent an hour and a half with a pedophile. I mean, that's the nature of the job. It's very different, but it's endlessly interesting.
One word that's rising, I think, on the ascendance in newsrooms now is the idea of synthesis, to synthesize, because time is short for everybody and information is longer than ever. And so, if you're going to get anything either fair or objective, you have to take it all in. Nobody has the time to do that, but you actually have to absorb and understand every side of it, regardless of where your own views lie.
Tony, how do you be fair or objective if, for example, you're interviewing, let's say a Nazi war criminal or something like that? How do you do that?
You do it in the same way that Diana approached the pedophile. Your first focus should be on your audience, and what is it about this interview that you want to present to your audience. I do think that many of us who have been journalists for a while, not quite like doctors, but we are able to kind of park our emotions and our points of view. I bet you if you could do a forensic check of a lot of journalists that we probably have fewer intensely held opinions than a lot of other people, because we're very aware of the gray in between the black and the white. So I think a Nazi war criminal, it's what's the point of the interview and what do I want out of the interview that would ultimately serve the audience. And I would almost, I would find, the actual encounter between me as a human being and him as a human being is almost impersonal to a point of not even kind of recognizing it.
Let me ask you the same question. Would you shake the hand of somebody you knew was pure evil?
No, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
I wouldn't.
You would make a conscious decision not to do that before going in?
I guess, and I have had, far less experience, certainly recently, in that, but I think generally my approach has always been that particularly when I'm in a potentially combative relationship about to happen, that any of these courtesies are artificial and perhaps confusing. And I generally am so reclusive and hermit-like that I don't shake anybody's hand. No, I'm kidding.
Let's see. I'm keeping an eye on the clock for everybody here, so let's get one more question in and then we'll call it a night.
Hi, my name is E, and I'm a recent grad from Waterloo, and I run a small software business here. My question is essentially revolves around this idea of international reporting bias and the kind of radical transparency new media forces like Twitter or Facebook or WikiLeaks would represent in terms of how you cover and what it means for you to cover. In particular, I'd like to ask Tony how that influences the general tone of a report, or how your report compares to other things, or what you choose to cover and what you don't choose to cover. Because especially in developing countries, some of the revelations from sources like WikiLeaks have been particularly revealing, even for people who you would expect would suspect or know better. But and in some cases, that's changed the landscape in terms of what you tell us and how we view the news. So how has that changed how you report, or where you report from?
I think the more transparency in everything, the better. Like, in other words, I think as a journalist, to me, WikiLeaks, the insights that one picked up by reading what essentially were the cables from U.S. diplomats back home. I read many, for example, that came from Qatar, from Doha. And some of them involved me, because I was the head of Al Jazeera English. Few involved me, I say, thankfully. Without getting personal about the U.S. crowd in Doha, I think most of them, in terms of their insight, were inept. They were almost beyond imagination, So, but I think, but I think the idea that they're made public is a good thing. I think that, I think most of us, and I include Al Jazeera, the CBC, and certainly commercial news organizations. We're institutions. They're institutions, and there are interests that these institutions try to protect. We say that our first aim is the public interest. I think on a good day it is, but on a bad day it's the corporate interest. So I think that's why I think we should be watched, however wonderful we are and how well loved we are by our children. And I think the kind of transparency that you're talking about, I think it's almost like punching open the windows, and the more you do it, the more sunlight enters the room. It's confusing. It's not as simple as the days when you had 2 newspapers and 2 networks and you had 2 columnists that you read. It's a very kind of chaotic world right now, but I think we're better off now in 2012 than we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Whether it'll settle down into a pattern that will be a bit more orderly, I'm not certain, because of just the technologies. But I think the extent to which the transparency and the WikiLeaks and all of these things that are now being made public, to the extent that they kind of put remind the institutions and the journalists who work for them that they are being watched by people whose primary interest is the public interest, I think ultimately at the end of the day is a good thing.
Speaking of the end of the day, that's the end of our day. I know you want to join me in thanking them for coming this evening to Waterloo and having such a great discussion.
Thank you very much. Just 2 things I'm up here to do. First of all, I'm here to thank our panel, Steve, Kevin, Mitch, Tony, and Diana, for an excellent discussion tonight. As a longtime denizen of newsrooms, I can't think of a better way to spend a night than 2 hours of shop talk. But for all of us, I'm a news consumer too, and for all of us who are news consumers, I think we come away from this evening with a greater understanding of how journalism works in a global context. And insights into how being a Canadian can either help or hinder a reporter on the job. That assumptions we think of as a Canadian perspective may inform the interviews or the story choices, but shouldn't stand in the way of great craft skills and good journalism. And that in this shrinking world, a well-informed newsreader would do well to dip into quality news coverage from sources all around the world. If it's worth $50 a month for you to get cable television, then surely by golly, it's worth $15 a month to support your local newspaper. Now, I just revealed my bias, but I think that's an important takeaway. And it's also important to remember that all of our panelists who have high-pressure careers under a lot of pressure on the job come here all the way to Waterloo from all places on the continent, in fact, for our edification tonight, for nothing more than a very good salmon dinner. So thank you very much for your time. And secondly, just a few brief notes for our audience. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CIGI's website in our online video archive. Thanks again to the Canadian International Council, Joan, and your group for helping to organize and co-sponsor this event, as well as our regular event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. And the next 2 events I just want to mention briefly. On June 14th, we meet here again in the CIGI Auditorium for an event called Broadcasting Revolution, How Media Have Influenced the Arab Uprisings. And this event features Beirut-based journalist, filmmaker, and analyst Habib Battah, looking at recent developments in transnational Arab media and broadcasting. And then on June 21st, don't miss the Canadian launch of a major CIGI report entitled Unleashing the Nuclear Watchdog, Strengthening Reform of the IAEI. CIGI Senior Fellow Trevor Finlay will present his findings from a 2-year review on how the International Atomic Energy Agency has been performing and how it should be improved. As always, stay tuned to the CIGI website for future events. Thanks for coming tonight or watching online. Mr. and Mrs. Potter, thank you for watching. And please have a safe journey home.
And I've tried to use that on occasion, to be seen to be maybe less threatening, less influential.
More of an honest broker?
Yeah, because I think we are still seen that way. I mean, notwithstanding our involvement in places like Afghanistan, which is now, I think, widely somewhat understood in parts of the world, and if not in others. I think we're still seen as being a level-headed player on the global scene, and that as journalists, we can use that to our advantage.
Mitch.
Well, I can say with certainty that the Americans do crave Canadian identity in certain situations. In the war in Iraq, I was tackled to the ground almost for Canadian pins, Canadian buttons, by U.S. reporters. They all wanted to be Canadians as we went into Baghdad. But, you know, I do think that in some respects it's probably a bigger challenge in a situation like that for a U.S. reporter. We do have a distinct advantage. However, as that conflict played out, you saw how the U.S. perspective was different from the one we brought back. And probably the sharpest example I can think of is the story, some of you might remember, the story of Private Jessica Lynch, who, you know, it was in the period of shock and awe, and
Just take 30 seconds, remind everybody what that was
the
about.
U.S. military broke the story initially that there was a special forces raid into the town of Nasiriyah to rescue this captured soldier, Jessica Lynch, who was brutally treated by the Iraqis. Dramatic raid in a hospital, you know, perfect movie material, saving Private Lynch. And there was no appetite to follow up on that story once Baghdad fell and more journalists came in. And so I was working, we usually work in groups in hostile environments like that. You partner up in the buddy system for security. And so I talked it over with my partner, who's a British reporter, Inigo Gilmore, and we thought it was worth burning a day or two and spending some gas and going down to Nasiriyah and sniffing around to see what if everything matched up there. And we independently ended up interviewing 9 of the Iraqi hospital staff. The doctors there spoke English at Nasiriyah Hospital. The story was antithetical to how it was first advertised. There was no Iraqi military presence at that hospital. There was no need for a raid, and Jessica Lynch herself got the best available care that they had. And the evidence for that was the fact that this was in sanctions era, the sanctions era, so there was one available titanium shunt to repair a badly broken leg. There were a whole range of...
Address this topic. I have the great privilege of introducing our moderator tonight, Mr. Steve Paikin, who's been a previous visitor to CG and whom I first met in the journalism business some 20 years ago. Steve will then introduce our esteemed panel, at least one of whom I've also been fortunate enough to work with side by side in the newsroom, Mitch Potter of the Toronto Star. Steve Paikin is anchor and senior editor of The Agenda with Steve Paikin, TV Ontario's flagship current affairs program. Before that, he was co-host of Studio 2, TVO's previous nightly current affairs program, and Diplomatic Immunity, the network's weekly foreign affairs program. An award-winning journalist, Steve was born in Hamilton, so was I, it's a great honor, has a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Toronto, a master's degree in broadcast journalism from Boston University. Earlier in his career, he worked at the CBC in Toronto and covered Queen's Park for a few years. He's hosted coverage of several elections and political leadership conventions, but he also has global experience, having reported, for example, from war zones from Lebanon and Israel in 1985, Bosnia in 1993. He's produced several excellent feature-length documentaries. He's the author of 4 books, 3 of them on politics, including a biography of former Premier John Robarts, and 1 book on Canada's other national and sometimes less violent sport, which is hockey. So please join me in welcoming this evening's moderator, Steve Paikin.
Thank you very much, Fred. It's great to be with you this evening. I indeed have been here before many times, but never for this event, and I'm particularly excited to share the stage with this very august group of people here. Nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. Herb Epp, remember sticking a few microphones in your face over the years back in provincial parliament. Walter McLean, good to see you again too. Pleasure to be in the room with you guys as well. But you know, my cousin was mayor of this place about 50 years ago. I don't know if you know that. Harold Paikin was the mayor of Waterloo here about 51 or 2 years ago. And despite that, you're never going to see my name on a ballot. Don't worry about that. The most important thing you need to know this evening is that I'm PVRing Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals, which I'm going to watch when I go home. So I'm sure all of you have got one of these devices here. If you found out who won the game, don't tell me. Very important, okay? No point in watching the game if you know who's won it already. We're going to have a discussion up here to start things off, and then at a certain point I'll give everybody the 2-minute warning, and we've got microphones on the side there, and you can line up, and we very much want your participation as well. This is only going to work as well as it might if you all decide to participate as well. So we look forward to your questions, and we also have, this is streaming all over the world apparently, so we may get some questions from those who are online, and we'll try and
Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight's signature lecture is co-sponsored by the Canadian International Council's Waterloo Region Branch. I'd also like to thank CIGI's regular public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Besides the audience here tonight, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI in the aisles, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. For those using Twitter during tonight's event, we encourage you to use the hashtag CIGILive to join in the online conversation. I'd now like to ask Joan Eiler, President of the Waterloo Region Branch of the Canadian International Council, to make welcome remarks on behalf of our co-sponsor.
Just a word of welcome to everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be part on this event, our 5th annual media event, and we're so looking forward to being able to hear such a wonderful panel and the fact that we can all participate if we so wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. Our topic tonight is bordered biases, national identity in world news coverage. As consumers of news media and as creatures of habit, we all might be unaware of how our own biases, including natural Canadian biases, could be built into the news coverage we receive of world events. As Canadians, we may notice a different tone and perspective in, say, how Fox News covers world affairs with a particular conservative American flavor. Or perhaps that flavor is the intended impact of Fox's owner, Australian Rupert Murdoch. And we can see readily how that perspective differs from, say, a CBC or a CTV report on the same event. Here in Canada, we can also watch the BBC. We see differences there. Those who travel frequently may see English language coverage from Russian networks or Al Jazeera. It isn't just the accents of the news presenters that are different. Something else is going on. So our question tonight is, how does national identity of the reporter, of the editors, of the network owners, or of the audience really affect the news that we receive here in Canada or anywhere in the world? We have an excellent panel here tonight to
work those into the mix as well. Let me introduce our panelists this evening. Diana Swain, one of Canada's leading investigative journalists, senior investigative correspondent for CBC News. Her work is frequently seen on the National and on the Fifth Estate. She has received 8 Gemini nominations, won the Gemini for Best News Anchor 3 times, which means, Diana, between the two of us, we have 3 Geminis. Yeah. When Fred said I'm an award-winning no, not really, actually. I don't think I've won anything. Anyway. Mitch Potter serves as Washington Bureau Chief with the Toronto Star. It's his 3rd foreign assignment after previous postings to London and Jerusalem. He oversaw the Toronto Star's coverage of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He won a 2006 National Newspaper Award for his reportage in Afghanistan. His dispatches include datelines from 26 different countries in this century alone. Kevin Carmichael, Globe and Mail correspondent based in Washington, D.C., where he writes primarily about the U.S. economy, monetary policy, and global economic policy. Before joining the Globe in 2008, he also worked at the Canadian Press, Bloomberg News, doing stints in Halifax, Ottawa, and Washington. And finally, a guy I used to work for, Tony Berman, has done absolutely everything in television news. He is the former head of Al Jazeera English and CBC News, now teaches at Ryerson University School of Journalism, also writes a weekly column on world affairs for the Toronto Star, and at the 2007 Gemini Awards, he received the Gordon Sinclair Award for Lifetime Achievement in Broadcast Journalism because he has done absolutely everything in television news. Welcome them, if you would, everybody. Tony, let me get you to start us off tonight. We're not going to have any opening statements. We're just going to get right into it. You've been all over the world, and I want you to tell us whether you think it is or has been an advantage to be a Canadian reporting from abroad.
I think it has been when one reports for a Canadian audience, and a Canadian audience that wants the Canadian perspective, I mean, which I think many Canadian news organizations, and certainly the CBC, is committed to. I think where I've had you ask me the question 4 years ago, before my experience with Al Jazeera, I would have been kind of unqualified in my enthusiasm for that perspective. But I do think that many of us who live, including here in Canada, want not only the Canadian perspective, but they also want a broader, more diverse perspective. And I think in that sense, there's an argument, whether it's through Al Jazeera, through the BBC, through The Economist, The Guardian, I think there is an argument that to get a comprehensive view of the world, one as crucial as the Canadian perspective is, and Canadian reporters abroad are, I think it's also important to tap into other sources.
You say you're a little less bullish about that answer, given your experience with Al Jazeera. What changed?
Well, I'm not less enthusiastic about the need for Canadians to report the Canadian perspective. What I am totally sold on is that there are certain news organizations that are blessed through resources or whatever in being able to tap into reporters from particular regions that know the culture, know the language, that are able to give a kind of an insider's perspective, whether it's of Yemen, whether it's of Syria, whether it's of Latin America. I think the perspective that, and I dealt with them in my role with Al Jazeera for a period of 3 or 4 years, and I think many of them provide a kind of a dimension and an inside look at stories that many of us Canadians who either lived abroad for a brief period of time or are kind of parachuted into news events simply can't bring, So I guess if I, as a Canadian here living in Canada, it would be, I think, very difficult and very limiting to me if I solely relied on the Canadian perspective on all issues. And I think now through the magic of technology, whether it's television or print or obviously the web, I think we can now tap into a variety of perspectives. In other words, I think the nationality does influence, if not determine, the perspective. And I think as such, I think we should probably seek a variety of sources.
I'm going to pick up on that later. We'll revisit that. Diana, how about you? An advantage to be a Canadian reporting abroad?
I think it can be, and maybe not for the reasons that people expect. I mean, we value our role in the world, and we do a lot of discussing and hand-wringing in Canada about our role in the world. But when we go out there, the reality is we are a small country. We are seen as a small player. Sometimes that can work to our advantage, that we're frankly seen as, in some ways, benign. If you get to a place and you're trying to get access to people, I think if you're an American journalist, and I'm sort of positing this theory now because I haven't worked as an American journalist, I think it can be tougher, that there's a greater intent to want to manipulate what you're seeing, what you're told, because of America's role in the world. Canada is seen as a sidebar in many cases, and I think that can be our advantage because people are less inclined to want to manipulate what they tell you. They're less frightened by what you might do with the information. I think it allows us sometimes greater access